Have you ever found yourself facing a seemingly unsolvable situation where everything appears lost and hope fades like mist at dawn? In those crucial moments of life, millions of believers around the world turn their eyes and hearts toward an extraordinary woman who lived over 5 centuries ago in a small Italian village. Santa Rita of Cascia, the patroness of impossible causes, shows us through her life that no obstacle is insurmountable when true faith and perseverance meet divine grace. Chapter 1. Childhood and Youth of Rita. The birth of Rita Lotti in 1381 in the small hamlet of Roccaporena in Italian Umbria was regarded by her parents, Antonio and Amata, as a true miracle. After many years of childless marriage and at an advanced age, this devout couple received their only daughter as a precious gift from heaven. The chronicles of that time recount that a swarm of white bees buzzed around the newborn's cradle without causing any harm, entering and leaving her mouth as she slept, a sign of the sweetness that her words would exude throughout her life. From her earliest years, Rita grew up in a home where the Catholic faith was not just a tradition, but the very center of daily life. Antonio and Amata, known in the region as the peacemakers of Christ for their mediation in the frequent disputes between rival families, instilled in their daughter the values of the gospel not only with words, but mainly through the silent testimony of their lives devoted to God and their neighbor. Every evening, the little family gathered before a simple wooden crucifix to pray together, a moment that Rita awaited with particular devotion. The signs of a special inclination toward the sacred soon manifested in the child. While other children her age played on the cobbled streets of Roccaporena, Rita sought the solitude of a small grotto near her home, where she improvised an altar with wildflowers and spent long hours in prayer. Neighbors marveled at how the little girl seemed completely detached from the outside world during these moments of contemplation, with an expression of serenity that belied her young age. As she grew in grace and beauty, Rita began to feel in her heart an unmistakable call to devote herself entirely to God. Drawn to the contemplative life of the Augustinian nuns of the nearby convent of Santa Maria Magdalena in Cascia, she expressed to her parents her desire to enter the convent when she was barely 12 years old. "I have seen my path laid out like a trail of light," she confessed to them one night, "and that path leads me behind the cloister walls, where I can wholly dedicate myself to my beloved." However, divine providence had other plans for shaping Rita's sanctity. Her parents, though deeply religious, considered marriage to be a safe estate for their daughter in those turbulent times marked by family rivalries and internal wars. With a heavy heart but faithful obedience, Rita accepted her parents' decision, offering this first great sacrifice as an act of submission to the will of God, who, by mysterious ways, would eventually lead her to the destiny for which she was created. Before continuing, we would like to know, have you ever experienced a miracle through the intercession of Saint Rita? Share your testimony in the comments and help spread devotion to this powerful saint. Your story might be the light someone needs in their moment of darkness. Don't forget to like and share this video with your loved ones. Chapter 2. The Forced Marriage. The day that Rita Lotti, at barely 18 years old, was married to Paolo Ferdinando Mancini in the small church of San Montano, a veil of silent resignation covered her youthful face. It was not the white veil of hopeful brides, but the invisible mantle of sacrifice accepted out of love for her parents and ultimately in obedience to what she interpreted as divine will. Paolo belonged to one of the most influential and feared families in the region, known for his violent temperament and active participation in family vendettas that regularly stained the streets of Roccaporena and its surroundings with blood. The early years with Paolo proved to be a true school of patience and humility for Rita. Chronicles recount how the young husband, accustomed to imposing his will through force and fear, found in his home a woman who responded to his outbursts of anger with dignified silence and a serene look that, far from provoking him, disarmed him. On nights when Paolo returned drunk after taking part in street brawls, Rita tended to him with the same tenderness she showed a sick person, washing his wounds and preparing infusions to calm his agitation, never uttering a word of reproach. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things, Rita repeated like a mantra during her long morning prayers before the rest of the household awoke. Instead of lamenting the fate that had befallen her, she transformed her home into a small sanctuary where she practiced Christian virtues in their most heroic expression. Neighbors observed with amazement how this seemingly fragile young woman handled her husband's difficult personality with a supernatural wisdom, never losing the dignity or the inner joy that flowed from her deep spiritual life. Rita's patience began to bear fruit when, after several years of marriage and the birth of her twin children, Giangiacomo Antonio and Paolo Maria, a gradual change was noticed in Paolo's behavior. The violent man who had entered the marriage began to moderate his character, slowly steering away from family feuds and seeking to resolve conflicts through dialogue instead of the sword. "My wife has taught me that true strength does not lie in violence, but in self-control," he once confessed to a close friend who could hardly believe the transformation he was witnessing. Yet in those turbulent times when family rivalries were passed down from generation to generation like an ancestral curse, Paolo's violent past was a debt that sooner or later would have to be paid. Rita sensed this danger and intensified her prayers for the complete conversion of her husband and the protection of her family. Every night, after everyone was asleep, she would kneel before a small wooden crucifix inherited from her parents and supplicate, "Lord, if tribulation is to come, let it find me prepared. I do not ask you to free me from suffering, but to grant me the strength to transform it into love, as you did on Calvary." Rita's prophetic words would soon be fulfilled much sooner than she imagined, as Providence was about to lead her on the path of widowhood and even greater sorrow, thus forging the character of the one who would later be known as the Saint of the Impossible. Chapter 3. Family Tragedy and Forgiveness. The afternoon of November 30th, 1412, was indelibly written in Rita's memory in letters of blood. That grey day in late autumn, when the last leaves fell from the trees as a sign of impending tragedy, Paolo Mancini was ambushed by members of the rival family while returning home after a day's work in the fields. His body, pierced by multiple stabbings, was found by a peasant at a bend in the road and taken to the small house where Rita awaited him with dinner prepared. The piercing cry that escaped her throat upon seeing her lifeless husband resounded throughout Roccaporina, not only as an expression of personal grief, but also as a lament for the spiral of violence that drained her land. The following days plunged Rita into an abyss of suffering, not only because of the loss of the one she had learned to love with Christian patience, but also due to the even greater danger now threatening her children. Giangiacomo Antonio and Paolo Maria, who were not yet 16, burned with a desire to avenge their father's death, incited by paternal relatives who saw in them the continuation of the family vendetta. "Your father's blood cries out from the earth," their uncles would repeat at each visit, planting in the adolescent hearts the poisonous seed of hatred and revenge. Faced with this desperate situation, Rita intensified her prayers to superhuman limits. Chronicles recount that for weeks she barely tasted food, dedicating entire days and nights to pleading for her husband's soul and, above all, for the salvation of her children from the infernal cycle of revenge. "I would rather see you dead than stained with human blood," she confessed to her confessor in a moment of extreme anguish, words that would turn out to be unexpectedly prophetic. As if heaven had heard her prayer literally, an outbreak of plague that was ravaging the region reached Roccaporina in the spring of 1413. The twins, weakened by months of pain and resentment, contracted the disease almost simultaneously. Rita cared for them with the devotion of a mother and the dedication of a consecrated nurse, never leaving their bedside. In their final days, when the fever intermittently gave way to moments of lucidity, she achieved the impossible, persuading both young ones to abandon their plans for revenge and to forgive from the heart the murderers of their father. "Mother," Paulo Maria whispered on the night before he died, "now I understand what you always taught us. Forgiveness is not weakness, but the greatest strength." His brother, from the adjacent bed, weakly nodded as he squeezed Rita's hand. "We forgive them, just as Christ forgave on the cross." Both died in peace, reconciled with God and their enemies, leaving Rita immersed in indescribable sorrow, but with the inner certainty that their souls had been saved from a fate far worse than physical death. Yet the most heroic act of Rita was still to come. A few days after the burial of her children, in a gesture that left the entire community astonished, she appeared before the rival families and publicly offered her forgiveness to the murderers of her husband. "What you have done to my family, I offer to God as a sacrifice for the peace of Roccaporena," she declared with a serenity that could only come from above. "The spilled blood does not cry for vengeance, but for reconciliation." This unprecedented act in a society governed by a code of honor and revenge marked the beginning of a process of pacification in the region, making Rita the spiritual heir to the reconciliatory work her parents had practiced decades before. Chapter 4. The Call to Religious Life. Now free from family bonds, yet with a heart torn by triple loss, Rita rediscovered that youthful longing she had sacrificed in deference to her parents, to devote herself entirely to God through religious life. At 36 years old, a widow without children, she saw before her the path she had always sensed as her true vocation. With this inner certainty, she went to the convent of Santa Maria Magdalena in Cascia, run by the Augustinian nuns, requesting admission into the community. The response she received was like a bucket of cold water on her hopes. "Our doors are open only to maidens of proven virtue, not to widows whose husbands died violently amid family rivalries," the prioress declared sternly. Although Rita was known for her piety, the social stigma associated with her family's involvement in local vendettas represented an apparently insurmountable obstacle. The convent rules, established precisely to keep the community apart from secular disputes, seemed to permanently bar her from the consecration she so longed for. Undeterred, Rita deepened her life of prayer and penance, convinced that if it was God's will, she would find a way to overcome this barrier. For 3 years, she lived in a small cell attached to the parish church of Roccaporena, where she devoted herself to caring for the sick, instructing local children in religious matters and mediating in local conflicts, following in the footsteps of her parents. Her reputation for sanctity grew among the locals, who came to her for advice and spiritual comfort. Tradition tells that one night in 1417, while Rita fervently prayed for a sign concerning her future, she experienced an extraordinary vision. 3 of her particularly venerated saints, St. John the Baptist, St. Augustine, and St. Nicholas of Tolentino, appeared to her, radiant and resplendent. "Follow us," they indicated. "The time has come for you to fulfill your destiny." Nay, miraculously levitating, the 3 saints carried her through the air from Roccaporena to Cascia, depositing her within the cloister of the Augustinian convent through walls that became permeable in their passage. The next morning, the community of nuns was astonished to find Rita in the convent's inner courtyard, a space completely closed off to the outside. The doors remained barred from within. The windows were too small to allow a person to pass through, and the high walls were impossible to scale. "How did you get in here?" asked the prioress, a mix of astonishment and suspicion in her voice. With humble simplicity, Rita recounted her mystical experience. Although some nuns expressed skepticism, the majority interpreted the event as an unmistakable sign of divine will. Finally convinced of its supernatural nature, the prioress accepted Rita as a novice in the community. The early days in the convent were not easy for the new postulant. Accustomed to the independence of her life as a widow devoted to charity, Rita had to adapt to the strict discipline of monastic life, the rigorous schedules, and above all, the absolute obedience expected of novices. Some younger sisters, who had entered the convent as maidens, regarded with some reservation the middle-aged widow admitted under such extraordinary circumstances. However, the humility with which Rita undertook even the most burdensome and unpleasant tasks of convent life, her punctuality at liturgical services, and her perpetually serene countenance, even in adverse situations, gradually won the respect and admiration of the entire community. On the day of her religious profession, when Rita pronounced her vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, witnesses claimed to have seen a supernatural radiance emanating from her face. The former widow Mancini definitively left behind her secular identity to become Sister Rita, the spouse of Christ and servant of her fellow nuns. Thus began the most fruitful period of her extraordinary existence, a time during which the trials and sufferings of her past would reveal their meaning as a providential preparation for the sanctity she was destined to achieve. Chapter 5. Spirituality and Asceticism. The walls of the convent of Santa Maria Magdalena in Cascia, far from serving as a barrier separating Rita from the outside world, became the sacred space where her soul spread its wings toward heights of mystical contemplation that amazed even her fellow sisters. Every corner of the austere building was for her an altar upon which she offered her life as a continuous sacrifice. Chronicles of the time recount that her cell, the smallest and most sparsely decorated in the convent by choice, transformed during her prayers into a luminous space where some nuns claimed to perceive inexplicable fragrances, like that of roses in the midst of winter. Rita's day invariably began 3 hours before dawn, while the rest of the community still slept. This time of solitude was dedicated to contemplative prayer before the Blessed Sacrament, during which she remained kneeling without any support for hours that seemed to her like mere moments. Time disappears when the soul immerses itself in the ocean of divine love, she explained to the novices who marveled at her physical endurance. This period of intimacy with God was followed by fervent participation in the divine office and the Holy Mass, during which she was frequently seen absorbed in an ecstatic state, her face transfigured and at times slightly levitating above the choir floor, a phenomenon attested by numerous witnesses. Not content with the mortifications prescribed by the already austere Augustinian rule, Rita also imposed on herself personal penances that she kept hidden from others, except for her spiritual director and the prioress. Beneath her black habit, she wore a rough cilice that constantly lacerated her skin. 3 times a week, she fed on nothing but bread and water, and every Friday, in memory of Christ's Passion, she disciplined herself with a whip of knotted cords until blood welled from her back. "I do not seek pain for pain's sake," she clarified when questioned by a sister about the severity of her practices, "but to identify with the sufferings of my crucified husband, so that not a single drop of his blood be shed in vain." Rita's devotion to the Passion of Christ reached levels so intense that they awed those who watched her during Holy Week. Charged with caring for and adorning the altar where the convent's oldest crucifix was displayed, she spent hours contemplating every detail of the sacred image, from the crown of thorns to the wounds on the feet, in a meditation so deep that she lost all sense of her surroundings. "In those moments," she once confessed to her confessor, "I see not a sculpture but Christ himself, living and suffering, who gazes into the very depths of my soul, questioning whether I am willing to share his cup to the very end." Despite the rigor of her ascetic practices, Rita never lost the supernatural joy that radiated from her intimate union with God. The novices under her guidance, since she eventually became the mistress of novices, were struck by the contrast between the severity with which she treated herself and the gentleness with which she embraced the frailties of others. True penance, she taught them, is not measured by external harshness, but by the love that motivates it. A small sacrifice made with perfect love is worth more in God's eyes than great austerities done out of spiritual vanity. Chaki. This simple yet profound wisdom, born not from books but from lived experience, led even the oldest nuns to seek her counsel in times of spiritual drought or temptation. The mystical phenomena that accompanied her life of prayer were not limited to the ecstasies during liturgy. Often, while working in the convent garden or performing the humblest domestic tasks, she would suddenly enter states of contemplative absorption that left her motionless. Her gaze fixed on a point invisible to others, her face illuminated by a beatific smile, and sometimes murmuring unintelligible words that some interpreted as conversations with celestial beings. When she came to herself after these raptures, Rita appeared confused and ashamed at what she considered a distraction from her duties, humbly apologizing to the community for the lost time spent in these experiences, which, in truth, constituted the very core of her contribution to convent life, the silent radiance of a sanctity that spiritually uplifted all her sisters. Chapter 6. The Miraculous Thorn. It was the year 1442. Rita was 61 years old and had already completed more than 2 decades of exemplary religious life when the most extraordinary and visible mystical phenomenon of her existence occurred. During Lent that year, a preacher invited to the convent for spiritual exercises centered his meditations on the Passion of Christ, with special emphasis on the crowning with thorns. Those words, which for other nuns were merely a pious theme for reflection, pierced Rita's soul like glowing darts, awakening in her an uncontrollable desire to participate more intimately in that aspect of redemptive suffering. On Good Friday afternoon, while the community rested after the liturgical services, Rita retired to the small side chapel where an ancient Byzantine crucifix was venerated, a depiction particularly expressive of pain. Kneeling before the image, her gaze fixed on the crown of thorns carved from dark wood, she began a prayer that was less an arrangement of words than an inner groan. Lord, allow me to experience at least a small part of the pain you suffered for love of me. She repeated this supplication again and again, with increasing intensity, gradually falling into a state of ecstasy that completely detached her from the surrounding reality. What happened next was witnessed by 2 sisters who, worried by her long absence, had gone in search of her. According to their testimony, one of the thorns from the crown adorning Christ's head suddenly detached from the carving, floated in the air for a few moments, and, propelled by an invisible force, shot toward Rita, embedding itself deeply in the center of her forehead. The impact caused her to fall backward, unconscious, while at the exact point where the thorn had penetrated an open wound began to form, bleeding profusely. When Rita regained consciousness, already in the convent infirmary and surrounded by a shocked community, her first instinct was to bring her hand to her forehead, where she felt a pulsating, burning pain. Noticing the blood flowing from the wound and understanding what had happened, her face lit up with an expression of supernatural gratitude. "He has heard my prayer," she murmured. "He has granted me to share his crown." The prioress, both astonished and fearful in the face of this prodigy, ordered that medicinal ointments be applied to close the wound, but they proved completely ineffective. The injury remained open, as if some mysterious force prevented it from healing, and it exuded a peculiar odor described in the chronicles as neither pleasant nor repulsive, but supernatural. Over the following weeks, rather than improving, the wound began to suppurate and emit an unpleasant smell that troubled anyone approaching Rita. This new development added further humiliation to the saint, for the community was forced to partially isolate her during communal gatherings. For 15 years, until the end of her life, Rita bore this visible mark of her participation in the Passion of Christ, enduring not only constant physical pain, but also the mortification of inadvertently causing discomfort to her sisters. "This crown is my most precious treasure," she would say when a novice dared to sympathize with her, "for it reminds me every moment that true love always hurts." Rita's case drew the attention of ecclesiastical authorities and physicians who came from various parts of Italy to examine this inexplicable phenomenon. None could find a natural explanation for a wound that did not respond to any known treatment, and yet did not become severely infected or compromise the general health of the religious beyond localized pain. The theologians who interviewed her were impressed by the total absence of spiritual vanity in Rita, who saw the stigma not as a privilege elevating her above others, but as a responsibility that demanded even greater humility and dedication. Particularly notable was the only time when the wound temporarily ceased to suppurate. This occurred in 1450, a Jubilee year in Rome, when Rita expressed her desire to make a pilgrimage to the Eternal City to obtain indulgences. Although the prioress understood her longing, she pointed out the impossibility of such a journey due to the repulsion her wound would cause among other pilgrims. Rita accepted the denial with her customary meekness, but that night, while she prayed, the wound miraculously closed and the foul odor completely disappeared. The following morning, when she presented herself before the prioress with a clean, healed forehead, the event was interpreted as a divine sign and the pilgrimage was authorized. Rita was thus able to fulfill her desire to visit the Roman basilicas, even being received by Pope Nicholas V, who was deeply impressed by her sanctity. Upon returning to Cascia, the moment she crossed the convent threshold again, the wound reopened and continued its usual course until the saint's death. The theological meaning of this particular stigma is profound within the Christian mystical tradition. Whereas other saints throughout history have received Christ's wounds on their hands, feet, and side, the case of Rita is exclusively centered on the crown of thorns, a symbol of the public scorn and humiliation that preceded the crucifixion. This detail is no accident, as it perfectly reflects the saint's spiritual journey. A life marked by humiliations and rejections transformed into an offering of love. The thorn on her forehead, visible to all, represented the mystical crowning of an inner process in which every suffering had been converted into redemptive love, following Christ's example. Chapter 7. Miracles in Life. Rita's reputation for sanctity, initially confined to the convent and the small town of Cascia, began to spread throughout the region of Umbria and beyond, as the prodigies associated with her intercession multiplied. Although the wound on her forehead already stood as a permanent supernatural sign, other miracles of a more practical nature, beneficial to those in need, began to manifest through her, confirming that her mystical union with Christ did not distance her from the concrete needs of suffering people. One of the most documented episodes occurred during a particularly harsh winter in 1445, when famine struck the region after successive failed harvests. The Augustinian convent, largely dependent on alms for its sustenance, found itself nearly devoid of provisions. The pantry contained little more than a handful of stale bread and some wilted vegetables, insufficient to feed the community of 20 nuns, as well as the poor who came daily seeking sustenance. The situation became so desperate that the prioress convened an extraordinary chapter to decide whether to temporarily suspend the distribution of food to the needy. At that time, Rita, serving as the convent's food steward, asked for the opportunity to speak. "Sisters, let us remember the words of our Lord, 'Give, and it shall be given to you.' Let us not shut our doors against the hungry, for Christ himself comes to us in them." She requested permission to organize a day of fasting and community prayer. offering that sacrifice to end the scarcity. That night, after everyone had departed, Rita remained in the chapel until dawn in intense prayer. The next day, when the sisters went to the pantry to prepare the meager breakfast, they found the shelves miraculously filled with fresh bread, fruits, and vegetables, enough to feed the convent and the poor for several weeks. No supplier had entered the building during the night, and the doors remained closed from the inside. The prioress, after investigating the matter, officially declared the event a divine intervention through Rita's intercession. Miraculous healings form another significant chapter in Rita's life story. Without formal medical knowledge, she displayed an extraordinary intuition for treating illnesses that baffled the physicians of her time. When the Black Death reappeared in Italy in the mid-15th century, Rita was granted permission to care for the plague-stricken, whom no one dared to touch. Against all odds, none of the patients she treated died, and she herself remained immune to contagion despite direct contact with the infected. The doctors who observed her work attributed these remarkable results not so much to the natural remedies she applied, medicinal herbs and blessed water compresses, but to the constant prayer accompanying every treatment and the laying on of hands that she practiced over the sick. One particularly famous episode was that of the garden in winter, which occurred during the final years of her life when, already elderly and weakened by penances and illnesses, she could scarcely leave her cell. A distant relative who had traveled from Roccaporina to visit her asked upon parting if she desired something from her native village. With a nostalgic smile, Rita replied, "If you could bring me a rose and 2 figs from the small garden of my paternal home, you would give me great joy." The request seemed absurd to the visitor, as it was deep winter with snow covering the fields. However, when passing by the abandoned Lotti family garden, she was astonished to see a rose bush in full bloom with a single perfect rose and a fig tree bearing 2 ripe fruits in the midst of a winter landscape. The visitor hastily gathered these impossible gifts and returned to the convent, where they caused general amazement and were interpreted as a divine sign of heavenly favor toward Rita. Phenomena of levitation during prayer became increasingly frequent as Rita advanced in her mystical life. Several nuns and occasional visitors to the convent testified under oath that they had seen the saint rise several spans above the ground while she prayed before the Blessed Sacrament, especially during Lent and Holy Week. In those moments, her face appeared transfigured by an inner radiance, and from her lips flowed words in unknown languages that some interpreted as the speech of angels. When she came out of these ecstasies, Rita recalled nothing of what had happened and appeared confused when questioned, confirming both the authenticity of the phenomenon and the absence of any pretense. Her prophetic gifts and her ability to read hearts were equally impressive. On numerous occasions, she predicted future events with astonishing precision, from trivial matters of convent life to historically significant events, such as invasions or political changes. Her spiritual director was particularly struck when Rita described in detail the contents of a letter he had just received, sealed in his pocket, without her having seen it by natural means. The gift of counsel she possessed attracted people of all social conditions who came to the convent's lattice seeking guidance. Many left in astonishment because Rita answered not only the questions asked, but also concerns that had not been voiced, but were deeply rooted in their hearts. Yet all these prodigies were eclipsed by the enduring miracle of her life, the transformation of an existence marked by suffering into a continuous hymn of praise and gratitude to God. The true miracle, she used to say to those marveling at her supernatural gifts, is not in performing extraordinary deeds, but in doing ordinary things with extraordinary love. This simple yet profound wisdom encapsulated the essence of her sanctity and explains why, centuries after her death, Rita is still invoked for seemingly impossible causes. Those human situations where only a miracle can open the path to hope. Chapter 8. The Rose and the Fig Tree. The rose and the fig tree have become the most recognizable symbols of Saint Rita, visual emblems that immediately identify her in Catholic iconography. The miracle of the rose occurred in January 1456, when Rita had been bedridden for nearly a year. Her relative, Magdalena Mancini, who visited her from Roccaporena at the time of parting, was met with a request from Rita that seemed impossible. "I would like to have a rose from the garden of my paternal home." In the midst of an alpine winter, with snow-covered fields and sub-zero temperatures, such a request appeared delirious. However, while passing by the abandoned Lotti family house, Magdalena discovered in the middle of the snowy garden a rose bush bearing a perfect red rose in full bloom. The contrast between the whiteness of the surroundings and the deep crimson of the flower created a striking image. Without hesitation, she took the rose and hurried back to Cascia. Presenting the flower to Rita, the saint declared, "This rose is not for me, but for all those who, in the winter of their lives, need a sign that divine spring always arrives, no matter how impossible it may seem." Complementing this miracle, in the same winter garden, Magdalena also found a fig tree bearing 2 ripe figs. The fig tree, a biblical symbol of abundance and divine blessing, acquired a special significance here. The 2 out-of-season fruits represented the 2 states of life that Rita had sanctified, the married life and the consecrated life, both fruitful in virtues despite adverse circumstances. The significance of these symbols has endured through the centuries. The rose bush of Roccaporena continues to produce roses even in winter, a phenomenon studied by botanists who find no scientific explanation. The fig tree, after having withered for decades, miraculously revived in 1577 when a sick pilgrim prayed beside it. Thousands of devotees make annual pilgrimages to these places, where numerous graces have been reported. Terminally ill patients experiencing inexplicable remissions, reconciled marriages, and seemingly impossible situations resolved unexpectedly. At the end of their visit, the pilgrims receive a blessed rose that they carry as a tangible reminder of St. Rita's intercession. Tradition holds that these roses maintain their color and fragrance for years, defying natural laws. This simple yet powerful symbol continues to convey St. Rita's essential message. Divine love can bloom in the most adverse circumstances, and nothing is impossible for one who places absolute trust in God. Chapter 9. The Last Years. The final 4 years of Rita's life, from 1453 to 1457, constituted the final crucible in which her sanctity reached its ultimate brilliance. A progressive and incurable illness gradually confined her to her convent cell, transforming what for many might have been a time of despair into the most fruitful stage of her spiritual journey. The nuns who cared for her agree that not a single complaint ever escaped her lips. On the contrary, when the pain intensified to extreme limits, a supernatural smile would light up her face. "Now I understand better the passion of my husband," she would murmur. "Each pang of pain is a kiss that brings me closer to him." This interpretation of suffering represented the culmination of a life entirely devoted to transforming tribulations into moments of grace. Her patience in the face of physical deterioration was particularly noteworthy. As the illness progressed, Rita lost the ability to move until she was completely immobile, depending on her sisters for even the most basic needs. This situation, especially mortifying for her active temperament, was accepted with an astonishing serenity. "Now I am like a child in the hands of its mother," she commented when a sister apologized for having to assist her. "And so we all must be before God, creatures who receive everything and can do nothing on their own." This physical helplessness contrasted with the intensification of her inner life. Her mystical states became almost permanent. The sisters recounted that they frequently found her in deep ecstasy, her face transfigured and her lips murmuring celestial words imperceptible to others. When she recovered from these raptures, Rita shared fragments of her visions, always with extreme humility and emphasizing that these were unmerited graces. Rita's influence on the community grew paradoxically as her physical strength waned. Her cell became the true spiritual center of the convent, where nuns of all ages came seeking her counsel. Even people from outside, having heard of the ailing saint, requested permission to visit her, leaving transformed by these encounters. They came seeking physical miracles, the prioress commented, but received something far greater, the healing of the soul and the peace of the heart. During these final years, Rita consciously prepared for her ultimate meeting with God. "Death is not an end, but a beginning," she would repeat to those who feared her imminent departure. Far from fearing this moment, she awaited it with the serene impatience of one who hopes to be reunited with the beloved after a long separation. Her last months were a continuous masterclass in the art of dying in peace, a lesson that would remain forever etched in the memory of those privileged enough to accompany her on her passage into eternity. Chapter 10. Death and Glorification. In the early hours of May 22nd, 1457, the feast of the Ascension of the Lord, Rita departed from this world forever and entered into eternity. After several days of serene agony, alternating moments of lucidity with profound ecstasies, the saint exhaled her final breath as the community prayed matins. The nuns present testified that at the precise moment of her death, the convent bells began ringing on their own, without anyone touching them, announcing throughout Cascia that their most illustrious resident had departed to meet her celestial husband. Supernatural phenomena accompanied her passing, the cell where she lay filled with an extraordinary light that illuminated the entire convent for several hours. An unknown fragrance, many compared it to that of freshly cut roses, emanated from her lifeless body, completely dispelling the unpleasant odor that had characterized her forehead wound for decades. The stigma itself, which had continuously suppurated since the thorn had embedded in her forehead, appeared completely healed, shining like a gem set in her skin. Rita's body immediately manifested signs of sanctity that astonished both physicians and ecclesiastical authorities. Far from exhibiting the expected rigidity of a corpse, her limbs remained supple, as if she were still alive. Her face, marked by years of suffering, appeared rejuvenated and serene, with an expression of peace that left onlookers in awe. Even more surprising was the partial incorruptibility that her body would display over the centuries. Although some parts would naturally mummify, her face, and particularly the forehead bearing the stigma, would remain incorrupt, defying the natural laws of decomposition. Popular devotion to Rita emerged spontaneously from the day of her death. The news of her passing spread like wildfire throughout the region, drawing multitudes eager to venerate her remains. Faced with the overwhelming influx of pilgrims, ecclesiastical authorities decided to postpone her burial by displaying her body in the convent church for several days. This unusual decision allowed for an extraordinary phenomenon. Thousands of people from all walks of life passed by her coffin, many experiencing healings and special graces simply by touching the habit of the deceased or invoking her intercession. The first posthumous miracle was not long in coming. During the funeral service, a paralyzed woman who had been carried to the church by her relatives suddenly rose, exclaiming with joy, "Saint Rita has healed me." Before the astonished eyes of the crowd, she began walking normally after years of immobility. This first public miracle was followed by many others in the subsequent weeks. Blind people regaining their sight, terminally ill patients being inexplicably cured, and seemingly irresolvable family conflicts finding paths to reconciliation. Finally laid in a modest stone sepulchre, Rita's body began to exude a fragrant liquid that the faithful collected as a precious relic, attributing to it curative properties. This phenomenon, known as the Manna of St. Rita, continues to occur intermittently to this day, a tangible manifestation of the enduring sanctity of one who, in life, transformed every suffering into redemptive love. Chapter 11. Legacy and Influence. The legacy of Santa Rita of Cascia transcends geographical and temporal boundaries. Beatified in 1626 and canonized in 1900 by Pope Leo X, her cult quickly spread throughout the Catholic world. Today, she is venerated as the advocate of impossible causes, to whom millions turn when all human hopes seem exhausted. The sanctuary of Cascia, where her incorrupt body rests, receives over 2 million pilgrims annually, becoming one of the most important centers of devotion in Italy. Parishes, hospitals, and charitable organizations under her patronage are found on all 5 continents, particularly in Latin America, where her maternal figure and closeness to human suffering have deeply touched the faithful. Her life offers a universal and timeless message. No circumstance, however adverse, is definitive when faced with faith and transformative love. The testimonies of graces received through her intercession fill entire archives in sanctuaries dedicated to her, confirming that her intercessory power remains as active as it was 5 centuries ago. In today's world, marked by divisions and conflicts, St. Rita emerges as a model of peacemaking and reconciliation. Her ability to forgive the murderers of her husband and transform hatred into love resonates especially in societies wounded by violence. Her example reminds us that true peace begins in the individual heart that renounces revenge and chooses forgiveness, no matter how impossible it may seem. Chapter 12. Prayer to St. Rita, Glorious. St. Rita, glorious St. Rita, patroness of impossible causes and advocate of desperate situations, I turn to you with the confidence of a child seeking maternal refuge in times of tribulation. You who have known pain in all its forms, as an abused wife, as a mother who lost her children, as a religious sister bearing on your forehead the mark of redemptive suffering, understand perfectly the anguish that now oppresses my heart. I beg you to intercede before the throne of the Most High for this intention that seems humanly impossible. Mention your request. Just as the rose bloomed in the midst of winter through your intercession, make hope blossom in the winter of my despair. I promise, if this grace is granted to me, to imitate your virtues of patience in adversity, to forgive those who have offended me, and to transform suffering into love. Help me understand, like you, that nothing is impossible for one who places absolute trust in God. St. Rita, mystical rose of Roccaporena, rose of patience in suffering, rose of strength in weakness, pray for us who turn to you in our need, so that we may be worthy of attaining the promises of our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.